Dakota Territory, winter 1884. The high prairie had gone white and quiet by the time he came down off the ridge. Snow lay over the open Dakota grassland in long, unbroken sheets, smoothing the low swells and smothering the sage until the whole world between the Missouri River breaks and the black line of distant buttes looked like one great, windswept shroud. The sky pressed down close, a low, bruised ceiling of cloud that turned the land flat and colorless. A few cottonwoods along the frozen creek bed stood black and leafless, their branches rattling softly whenever the northern wind remembered itself and came knifing out of the plains. On most days out here, sound didn't travel far. The next ranch might be 10 miles off, the next town 30. You could ride a whole day in the Dakota Territory and see nothing but your own tracks behind you and a thin line of smoke on some far horizon that might be a homestead and might just be your eyes playing tricks. Luke Harrow rode through that silence, as if the cold were just another weight thrown onto a back already bowed. His bay gelding moved carefully over the drifted track that followed the little creek, a nameless feeder that eventually found its way to the cannonball. Luke sat crooked in the saddle, coat collar turned up against the Dakota wind, hat brim pulled low over his eyes. The air came at him clean and hard, looking for seams. It found the worn places in his gloves, the threadbare cuff of his coat, the scar under his ribs where an old bullet had gone in hot years back on this same wide prairie and left something colder behind. The leg that matched the scar ached in time with the horse's steps. It did that when the weather turned raw on the plains, when he'd ridden too far without stopping, or when something in the air reminded him of the night, not far from this very creek, that he'd stepped between a drunk with a gun and a green kid who didn't yet know what it cost to be brave in the Dakota Territory. By mid-afternoon, the light had gone thin and colorless, the way it did on winter days when evening came early and the day seemed to give up before it had properly begun. Luke squinted against the snow glare, eyes narrowed, scanning the basin. He rode this stretch alone more often than was wise, but solitude had its own kind of company. The silence didn't ask him to answer for anything. Today, though, the silence wasn't empty. Up ahead, near the crooked line of cottonwoods that marked the creek, something broke the clean white. A dark smudge on the pale rise. Not rock, not bush. It had the wrong shape for both. The horse saw it too. His ears pricked, breath puffing harder. Luke reined in, letting the gelding stand a moment, listening. No shouting, no gunfire, no crash of breaking wood. Just the soft hiss of wind over snow and the faraway mutter of half-frozen water under ice. Whatever trouble that mark on the land represented, it wasn't making noise anymore. He nudged the gelding forward. As he drew nearer, the shape resolved itself. A wagon lay half-canted into a shallow ditch, one wheel splintered, canvas top bowed in, ribs broken. Snow had already begun to drift up against it, softening the hard lines of ruin. One the team lay down, legs at a bad angle, eyes open. The other was gone, tracks already half-filled, vanishing toward the hills. Luke swung down, his bad leg complaining as his boots sank into the drift. He put a gloved hand on the dead horse's neck, out of habit more than hope, then moved on. The wagon's tongue stuck out toward the road at a forlorn angle, like a question that hadn't been answered in time. The back flap had been cut open. He stepped closer, one hand on the butt of his Colt, the other lifting the canvas enough to look inside. Empty. No trunks. No boxes. No bodies. The floorboards showed scuffed prints where boots had dragged things out in a hurry. Bandits, most likely. This road saw enough of them. Stage lines supply wagons, folk trying to get a jump on spring. Men who lived thin in the hills got to counting other people's goods as their own when the cold set in. He let the flap fall. It was the movement down by the creek that pulled his eye next. Just the smallest shift of contrast against the snow. Dark against white. Stillness against movement. A figure, half hidden at the edge of the cottonwoods. He moved toward it, boots crunching, breath smoking in the late light. She sat with her back against a tree, knees drawn up, arms around them, as if she were trying to fold herself into a smaller shape the world might overlook. Snow had gathered on the shoulders of her coat and in the loose strands of hair that had come free from the knot at the back of her neck. Her dress, once a blue-gray, was streaked with dust and old mud beneath the hem. One bootlace trailed, undone, half buried in the drift. Her face was turned toward the creek, toward the narrow thread of dark water, showing through the ice. Pale skin, a faint scatter of freckles across the bridge of her nose, mouth set in a hard line like someone who had decided long ago that smiling cost more than it was worth. Her eyes, when she turned them toward him at the sound of his approach, were a gray-green that put him in mind of storm light glancing off water. Tired, hollow, but with something small and stubborn still burning under the ruin. There was a cut along her cheekbone, half-healed, and a bruise on her wrist where her sleeve had ridden up. She watched him come with a look that wasn't fear so much as resignation. "If you've come to finish the work," she said, voice low and rough in the cold air, "you're late." They took what they wanted an hour back. Her hands tightened around her knees. The river went on whispering beside them. Luke stopped a few paces away, snow creaking under his weight. Up close, he could see how thin she was, how the fabric hung at her shoulders, how the breath she drew made a shiver move through her frame she tried to hide. "I didn't come to finish anything," he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, like it had forgotten the feel of words meant for someone else. "Just saw a busted wagon and tracks going nowhere. Figured I'd look." "You looked," she said. "Now you can ride on." He studied her, head tipped a fraction. "You hurt?" he asked. "Not the way you mean." Her gaze flicked down, as if checking. "They pushed me aside when it was done. Took the team, took the strongbox, took the driver's watch right off his body. Left me the wagon wreck and my skin. More than they owed me." Her tone made skin sound like something worth less than the snow she sat in. "Stage?" Luke asked. "Freight from Fort Bridger," she said. "A trader hauling things east. I bought a place in the back with what coins I had left." Her mouth twisted. "Seems I should have bought a horse instead." Luke glanced back toward the road. The wind had already begun to blur the tracks of the men who'd done this. For horses at least. Maybe 5. No bodies near the wagon, though. No fresh mounds of snow that might hide rough burials. Either the driver had gone down further along, or they'd taken him with them for reasons he didn't much care to imagine. He looked back at her. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated a heartbeat. "Grace," she said. He thought of the word, and how far from it this place felt. Snow and ruin and a wagon gutted like a carcass. A woman sitting alone at the edge of a half-frozen creek, her hands shaking against her will. "Grace what?" he asked. She lifted her chin a little. "Just Grace is enough for most folk," she said. He could hear the spaces around the words. The places where other names had been, once, and been stripped away by time or choice or shame. "You got a coat on," he said, "but it's thin. This cold won't stay on the outside much longer. You planning to sit here till you freeze, or you got another notion?" She gave him a look that held a flash of something like anger, then went dull again. "I was waiting," she said. "For who?" he asked. "For the part where it gets quiet enough in my head," she murmured, "that I can step in that river and not hear all the names I'd be dragging under with me." Luke felt the words land inside his chest like stones dropped down a well. He'd seen men talk about wanting to die before. In prison yards, on battlefields, at card tables with nothing left to bet. Most of them said it loud, sloppy with whiskey and self-pity. None of them scared him much. This was different. Grace spoke like a woman reciting a figure she'd tallied up a long time ago and never quite dared to solve. He stepped closer. "You stand up," he said. Her eyes flashed. "You deaf?" she asked. "I said, I heard what you said." His voice stayed even, though his leg throbbed in the cold, and something under his ribs pulled tight. "Stand up." She gave a small, humorless huff. "I ain't worth saving," she said. "You don't even know what I've done." He looked at her for a long moment, coat flapping a little in the wind, hat brim shadowing his eyes. "Maybe I don't," he said quietly, "but I know this much. No one deserves this." The words came out rough, scraped on their way past old hurt. But he meant them more than anything he'd said in years. She stared at him. Her hands, clenched around her knees, loosened the smallest fraction. "Folks in town wouldn't agree with you," she said. "Not if they saw my face next to 3 lines of type on a wall." "Town can think what it pleases," he said. "Out here it's you and me and the cold." You stay, you die slow. You come with me, maybe you don't. Seems a poor bargain to turn down. He held out a hand. For a long minute she didn't move. The wind worried at the shawl on her shoulders. The river went on murmuring against its ice. Somewhere overhead, a crow called black against the fading sky. Then, with a small, exhausted sound, Grace let her legs unfold. She reached for his hand. Her fingers were cold enough that the touch felt like dipping his hand in the creek. He tightened his grip anyway, steadying her as she stood. She wobbled once, bare toes curling the snow where her bootlace trailed. He bent without thinking, bad leg complaining, and tied it for her, fingers clumsy in the cold. "Can you ride?" he asked, straightening. "A little," she said. "Better than I can walk where I'm headed." He led her toward the gelding. Getting her up into the saddle cost him more than he liked to show. Pain flaring sharp under his ribs as he braced and lifted, but he swallowed any sound that tried to push past his teeth. She settled awkwardly, dress bunched, hands finding the saddle horn like someone used to hanging on with more than skill. He swung up behind her, one arm coming around to hold the reins, the other braced near her side, careful not to cage her. She smelled faintly of soap and old smoke. The kind of scent you picked up in cheap rooms above noisier lives. When the horse moved out, she made no protest, only let her head dip, eyes on the fall of the snow ahead. They rode toward the hills, away from the road, away from the wagon. He did not look back. The line cabin sat where the foothills began, tucked into a fold of rock and scrub like something the land had tried to hide and half succeeded. One room, low-ceilinged, with a stone hearth and a hard bunk and a table scarred by men who'd used it for everything from card games to surgery. Luke had used it himself, more than once, when weather or work kept him from making the longer ride back to town. By the time they reached it, the clouds had sagged even lower. Snow came thicker now, the kind that stuck in eyelashes and found its way down collars no matter how carefully cinched. Luke swung down and helped Grace off the horse. Her legs buckled once when her boots hit the packed snow. He kept a hand under her elbow until she steadied. Inside, the cabin smelled of old ash and dry wood and animal coats. He got a fire going as quick as numb fingers allowed, feeding it kindling, then larger pieces until heat began to push the cold back from the room's corners. Grace stood near the door, shawl clutched tight, eyes moving over the small, bare space. Bunk, table, rough shelf with a few tins on it. Pegs for coats. Nothing else to mark a life. "You bring all your strays out here?" she asked, after a while. "Just me mostly," he answered. "Sometimes a busted hand. Sometimes a cow, when the weather's mean and the barn's full." She gave the faintest ghost of a smile. "Reckon I fall somewhere between the two," she said. He poured water from the barrel into a dented pot, set it near the fire to warm. The act of tending, of doing, settled something in him. He was better with tasks than with talk. Tasks didn't ask him why he'd put a bullet into a man once and left another to bleed. Tasks didn't look at him with gray-green eyes and ask if he believed they were worth more than the sum of their sins. When the water steamed, he found a clean scrap of cloth and a small tin of carbolic he kept for trail injuries. Grace watched his hands move. "You hurt anywhere I can help?" he asked. Honest now. She hesitated, then held out her wrists. The bruises there were ugly, finger marks mostly, old and new layered. "Weren't the bandits did those," she said. "No," he said quietly. "I know who leaves marks like that." He cleaned them without comment, the way he'd clean a rope burn on a colt. Gentle, efficient, focused on the skin and the stain and not on the story. "You wear a gun," she said suddenly, watching his hands. He glanced down at the Colt on his belt. "I do," he said. "You any good with it?" she asked. "Good enough," he said. "Was it you?" Her voice was even, but something in it went brittle. "Back in Green Hollow. A year ago. Man named Tate, running a game out of the back of the saloon. They said a cowboy shot him through the shoulder to keep him from beating a girl to death with a brandy bottle." Luke's hand went still on her skin. He remembered Green Hollow, remembered the smell of stale beer and sweat, the sound a bottle made when it hit bone, the way Tate's eyes had gone flat with surprise when the bullet took him. He hadn't stayed to see if the man lived or died. Hadn't wanted to stick around for the law to decide whether stopping murder counted as murder when you did it with a gun in a room already full of bad intentions. Yeah, he said at last. That was me. Grace's breath left her in a short, sharp rush. I was the girl, she said. He looked up. She met his gaze, eyes steady despite the tremor in her voice. Tate bought me off a man who owed him money, she said. Used me to pay off other debts. I'd have been dead that night if somebody hadn't put a bullet in him and kept walking. Didn't even stay to see if I could stand. He felt the memory shift inside him, like a picture someone had moved the frame on. You were worth saving then, he said. She let out something that might have been a laugh, might have been a sob. Didn't feel like it, she said. Still doesn't most days. He finished with her wrists, wrapped them in clean cloth torn from an old shirt, then sat back on his heels, the firelight sliding over his features, catching the lines around his mouth, the fatigue in his eyes. Tell me, he said quietly, what's on that wall in town next to your face? She looked at the flames. Accessory to robbery, she said. Assault. They talk like criminals put them words down with ink. Truth is, I poured drinks and smiled at men who wanted to pretend what Tate's boys did in the dark belonged only to them. I told myself I wasn't the one holding the gun or the knife or the rope. Her jaw clenched. When the marshal came, he threw us all in the same cell. He thought of the wanted posters he'd seen now and then. Rough wood, rough paper, rougher faces, men and women both. The way a few lines of print could flatten a life into a list of reasons to hang someone. You serve time, he asked. Long enough to learn the sound the world makes when it forgets you, she said. They let me out when the jail got full, and the judge decided I wasn't worth feeding through another winter. She shrugged. I left town with what I had in my pockets, she went on. Thought maybe if I could make it as far as my sister's place in Omaha, I could start over. Make beds, wash shirts, be nobody. Wagon was supposed to get me half the way. He could see the journey in the set of her shoulders, the miles layered in the circles under her eyes, the way she'd walk down that snow-covered road toward his land as if it were the last straight line left to her. You came this far, he said. That count for something. She looked at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. Count for what? She asked. For the fact you ain't in that river, he said. Silence folded into the corners of the room again, warm now instead of cold. Outside, the wind pushed at the walls, looking for a way in. The snow thickened, blowing in dry sheets past the single small window. Night dropped down early, bringing with it the particular kind of darkness the territory saved for storms. Dense, almost tangible, pressing against the frail light of the cabin fire. Grace dozed in fits in the bunk, more from exhaustion than comfort. Luke sat near the door, chair tilted back, hat pulled low, listening to the storm and to the small sounds a wounded soul made when it thought no one could hear. He wasn't sure when he first caught the other sound under it. A low, distant thud, then another, then a jingle of metal against tack, faint through the wind. Horses, more than one. He slid the chair down on all fours, stood, and moved to the window, easing the curtain aside with 2 fingers. At first he saw only blowing white, the dark suggestion of the cottonwoods beyond. Then, through a brief break in the drifting snow, he saw them, 3 riders, moving slow but steady up the trail, hunched in their coats. They weren't ranch hands. He'd have known the shapes of his own. You expecting company? Grace asked from the bunk, voice thick with sleep and alarm. No, he said. He crossed to the peg by the door and took down his rifle. She sat up, blanket falling to her lap, eyes wide in the firelight. Bandits, she whispered. Maybe, he said. Maybe the marshal, she said. You think word travels slow in these parts? Wagon gets hit, woman goes missing, 3 men ride out. Could be they're here to bring me back to the wall where my name's written. Her hands gripped the edge of the bunk, knuckles pale. If they are, she went on, voice low and fierce, you let him. I won't have you shot for someone like me. He checked the rifle's chamber, fingers calm by long habit. Someone like you, he said, is a woman sitting in a bunk with the marks of other men's hands on her wrists and a wanted notice built of half-truths chasing her shadow. I've known worse souls driving church wagons. The hoofbeats came closer, the sound muffled by snow but still distinct. I ain't worth it, she said. Not your blood, not your life. He looked at her, really looked, at the way fear and defiance warred in her eyes, at the way her shoulders curled, as if trying to make herself small enough to slip past whatever judgment was riding up that trail. "Maybe I ain't doing it for you alone," he said quietly. "Maybe I'm doing it for all the ones I didn't stand up for when I should have." He moved to the door. "Lie down," he said. "Keep still. Let me talk first." She didn't like it. He could see that. But she did it, easing back under the blanket, body taut as a pulled rope. The knock came a few heartbeats later. "Cabin," a voice called over the wind. "Ryder inside. Open up." Luke opened the door. Snow and cold pushed in past the three figures on the stoop. Two wore deputy badges dark against their coats. The third had the lean, rangy look of a man used to working on the edge of the law, his eyes sharp and restless under the brim of his hat. "Evening," Luke said. "Depends who you ask," the rangy man answered. "Name's Carter. This is Finch and Tate. We're riding out of Dodge Creek on county business." "What's your name?" "Harrow," Luke said. "Luke Harrow. This cabin's on Brant land. I watch his stock along this line." "Brant," Carter said. "Rich fella. Wouldn't much miss a little lost meat here and there." "I don't much care what he misses," Luke said. "He pays me to care what gets on and off his range." "What's your business?" They pushed their hats back, snow dusting their shoulders. "Freight wagon got hit not far from here," Deputy Finch said. "Driver dead. One passenger missing. Grace Rowan. Wanted in 3 counties under one name or another." "You seen any sign of her?" Luke felt the lie sit heavy on his tongue, waiting. He glanced back, just once, into the cabin shadow. Grace's form was still in the bunk, still and small under the blanket. He could say he'd only just arrived. Say he'd seen no one. The storm might cover any tracks before morning. The law would ride on. Grace would get her wish by omission. He'd stay clean. Instead, he said, "I've seen signs of folk worse than whatever's written on your paper. Don't mean I invite him in." Carter's eyes narrowed. "That ain't an answer," he said. "I saw the wagon," Luke said. "Back down the basin. Saw horse tracks. Saw blood. Saw no reason to drag a dead man out from under a busted wheel with a storm coming. If you're tracking his killers by the print of their boots, you'll find nothing here." Deputy Tate shifted his weight. "Marshall's got her face posted in Dodge Creek," he said. "Men say she helped bleed more than one traveler with the likes of Tate and Crow." He jerked his chin toward Luke's holstered Colt. "Folk who travel alone in storms sometimes help themselves to more than coffee and shelter." Luke's hand itched. He kept it away from his gun. "You want to search the place?" he said. "You can. It's 4 walls and a bunk. Nothing much to hide." He stepped aside. Carter looked past him, eyes adjusting to the dim. "Appreciate the hospitality," he said, with a smile that wasn't. They came in, boots thudding on the plank floor. Finch glanced at the table. The unused second cup. The extra blanket. He moved toward the bunk, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Grace lay still, face turned slightly toward the wall, hair hiding her features. She looked smaller than she had by the creek. Younger. "Who's this?" Finch asked. "Picked her up half-froze off the trail," Luke said. "Said her name was May. Mule skittish tossed her and ran. I wasn't fixin' to leave her for the wolves." "That's so?" Carter asked. He reached down and brushed a strand of hair from her face. Grace's eyes flashed open. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Carter smiled, slow and satisfied. "Well now," he said, "if that ain't the lady the marshal wants a word with." Grace's hand twitched toward her side, an old reflex reaching for a knife she didn't carry anymore. Luke stepped forward, more instinct than intent. "That's far enough." Tate snapped, raising his revolver. Finch drew his as well, pointing it toward the bunk. Grace pushed herself up on her elbows, breath coming quick and shallow. "I'll go," she said. "You don't need to drag him into this." "Look at that," Carter said. "Conscience. Funny thing to see in a woman with your reputation." He reached for her arm. Luke moved between them. The room shrank to the line of his shoulders, the space between his chest and Carter's outstretched hand, the twin black mouths of the deputy's guns. "Step aside," Carter said. "She's wanted. We got a job to do." Luke thought of dusty wanted posters, of crowded jails, of men who earned their pay by turning pain into paperwork. He thought of Grace by the river, saying she wasn't worth saving. He thought of Green Hollow, of Tate's bottle raised above a young woman's head, of his own hand lifting the gun that made the difference between breathing and bleeding out in sawdust. Job's one thing, Luke said quietly. Justice is another. Marshall'll sort that, Finch said. Ain't your worry. Luke shook his head. He could feel the old ache in his side, hot now alive. As if the bullet scar there recognized the shape this moment was taking. She walked away from men worse than you, because I put her round where it needed to go once, he said. I ain't about to stand back and watch you drag her off to a rope for their sins, as much as hers. Last warning, Tate said. His knuckles were white on the gun. Snow still clung to the brim of his hat. Luke met Grace's eyes over his shoulder. There was fear there, and something else. A plea, not for herself, for him. I told you, she whispered. I ain't worth. Shut up, Carter snapped. Luke didn't shut up. You want her, he said. You're going to have to go through me. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't brave in the way songs talked about. It was just sure. Carter's smile faded. Have it your way, he said. The gunshots were thunder in the small room. Luke felt the first bullet hit high, near the old scar, a hot, crushing punch that took his breath. The second grazed his arm. He staggered, gripped the edge of the table, forced himself to stay up long enough to draw and fire once, twice, a third time. Tate went down, hand to his shoulder, gun tumbling from his grasp. Finch's hat flew off as a shot shaved the brim. Carter dove sideways, swore, fired again. White pain, then red. Luke's legs gave out. He hit the floor hard, boards jarring his bones. Somewhere, the lamp went over. Fire leaped higher in the hearth as fresh air rushed in through a broken pane. Smoke curled, confused. He felt, distantly, the weight of somebody falling near him. Heard shouting, cursing, a crash as a chair went over. The sounds came from the end of a long tunnel. Luke, Grace's voice sounded far away. He tried to answer, found only blood in his throat. Hands on his shoulders, on his face. Stay with me, she said. You hear? Don't you go where I was going. Not now. Not for me. He wanted to tell her it wasn't for her alone. It was for Owen, for the girl in Green Hollow, for every time he'd walked past someone drowning with their hand just above the surface and told himself it was none of his business. What came out was a ragged whisper. Window, he managed. Storm will cover. Shut up, she said, tears hot on his face where they fell. For once in your life, let somebody else do the moving. Hands dragged. Boots thudded. There was the sound of a body being hauled across the floor. A curse cut short. A gun clattering out of reach. Then cold air. Snow, sharp and clean, on his face as she pulled him toward the door. He didn't know how she did it. She was slight, and he was not. But fear and fury and some wild, desperate determination lent strength. She got him as far as the low drift by the cabin wall, snow wrapping around him like a rough blanket, his blood steaming in the cold. Inside, a voice groaned. Finch, maybe. Or Carter. Grace looked down at Luke. You stupid, stubborn man, she whispered. Why would you do this? He tried to smile. Told you, he said. No one deserves this. Her laugh broke on a sob. Not even me? She asked. He remembered her by the river, hair full of snow, saying she waited for quiet enough to step in. He remembered the way she had knelt by the fire, wrists bare and marked, telling him what the law said she was. Especially you, he said. The darkness at the edges of his vision crept closer. Listen, he rasped. We're close to the Brant Line shack, south side. Ray rides it. Good man. He'll come when the storm settles. You tell him what happened. Tell him I changed my mind on some things. Her hand tightened around his. You tell him yourself, she said. Maybe, he murmured. Maybe not. He could hear the river in his head. Not the creek by the cabin, smaller, meaner. The big one in the basin, moving slow and sure. The sound of something that kept going, no matter what men dropped into it. Luke, she said. He looked at her. The wind threw snow into her hair again, lined her lashes with white. If I live, she said, I'll carry this. You hear me? I'll carry you in it. I'll tell folks there was a man once who put his body between the law and a woman the world said wasn't worth the bother, and that he died, saying nobody deserved what I thought I did. He wanted to tell her that sounded like more than he'd earned. He wanted to tell her he was just a tired cowboy with a bad leg and a heavier conscience, try to even a scale that had been off balance too long. What he said was, "That'd be enough." His fingers slipped in hers. The storm closed in. They found them the next morning. Ray and two ranch hands rode out when the snow finally blinked and gave the world back to itself. They followed hoof tracks half-filled, spotted blood on the drift, saw the busted-in door of the line cabin and smoke still curling from the chimney. Inside, Tate lay tied with his own belt, cursing weakly, shoulder bandaged by a hasty hand. Finch was slumped unconscious by the wall, head wrapped in torn shirt. Carter was gone. His trail led off into the hills, one boot print dragging. A man who'd decided the wages weren't worth the work anymore. Outside, in the lee of the cabin, Luke Harrow lay in the snow. His eyes were closed. His face was oddly peaceful, as if the lines grief and guilt had carved there had smoothed out in the night. There was blood on his shirt, dark and stiff. His hand was stiff too, fingers curled as if they still held someone else's. There was no sign of Grace, just a set of lighter boot prints leading away toward the trees, toward the long sweep of the basin, as if she'd stepped into the storm and walked out the other side. Ray took his hat off. "Damn fool," he muttered, voice thick. "You were supposed to live long enough to be old and cranky, you know that." The hands said nothing. They just lifted Luke carefully, carried him inside, laid him out on the bunk with his hat on his chest. Later, in town, folks argued over the story. Some said Grace had shot him and run. Some said the law had done it and lied. Some said it was just what happened to men who took in strays. But there were others, ones who'd seen the marks on Grace's wrists when she poured their drinks in Green Hollow, ones who'd heard a girl crying behind thin walls and done nothing, who looked at the line cabin, at the word Ray scratched into a crude board at the foot of Luke's grave on the hill above it, and thought about what it meant for a man with a past to die on the side of someone else's. Months later, in a town far downriver, a woman called Grace washed linens at a boarding house and kept her head down. She went to church on Sundays and sat in the back, where the light through the high windows fell soft and uncertain. She listened when the preacher talked about mercy and justice and why they rarely arrived wearing the same coat. When a girl came in one night with bruises on her arms and fear in her eyes, Grace took her hand and said, "You can stay with me." When the girl said she wasn't worth the trouble, Grace's reply was quiet, sure. "No one deserves this," she said. "I knew a man once who proved it." On cold mornings, when the wind blew just so, she could almost hear the sound of a Montana river under ice. Slow, steady, carrying the memory of a cowboy who'd ridden alone until the world asked him, quietly, to do one thing that cost him everything and somehow made his life more than the sum of what he'd lost. He didn't get his happily ever after. He didn't get the porch and the shared coffee and the long, easy years. But he did get this, a woman who lived when she'd meant to die. A life turned a half-degree toward the light because he'd stood where he was and refused to move aside. A tragically hopeful ending, written not in ink or on a wanted poster, but in the way a single choice can echo along a river long after the man who made is gone.